Hi, class. This week we're going to be focusing on interagency collaboration and community mapping. I know the required reading for this week really was just around community mapping and this concept of community mapping with Google Maps, but there are lots of other supplemental readings that talk about collaboration. And then I left you with lots of resources. We have a Padlet that's specific to school teams and how they can collaborate better with lots of resources and a tool. So hopefully you'll find those additional resources helpful. I'm going to try to keep this presentation relatively short because I have added one other video for you to watch, and that is my colleague, Crystal Emery, who is kind of our expert on interagency collaboration. So that is about a 25-minute video I'd like you to watch. And that was one of our monthly transition talks. This is something we do at the State Board of Education where we have a topic every month related to transition, and we invite educators to come and join us. And we presented about a 30-minute topic, and then we kind of open it up for Q&A sessions. So before we close out the semester, I'll give you more information on our transition talks for the rest of this year. And also hopefully we'll have those built out for next year too. So then you guys can actually join those live transition talks. So with that, I'm just going to kind of keep this overview relatively short. Our learning intentions for this week really are for you to be able to describe what interagency collaboration is and why it is so important and why it's an evidence-based practice for transition. And also that you can have some idea and be able to describe what this concept of community mapping is for students with disabilities and how that can really help support them to connect with the community, whether that be for work or leisure or further education and training, because we know that if students are more connected to all kinds of things in their community, they're going to have better post-school outcomes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We have another week set aside to really dive into community mapping in more detail. So I'm just going to kind of touch upon it this week. But we talked a lot about the predictors, right? Those 23 predictors of post-school success. And if you recall, one of those predictors is this idea of collaboration, both interagency and also intra-agency collaboration. So we know it's a predictor of post-school success for students with disabilities when it occurs across different areas, right? So we know that if we collaborate better with education and also within vocational rehabilitation, if we collaborate best with families and other partners that provide, any type of instruction or experiences around transition services, we're going to have better outcomes. So we know that if we have really well-developed partnerships for planning and service delivery, that it's going to benefit students and families a lot, right? So it's not just handing them a brochure and saying, oh, go check out this agency. It's deeper than that, right? It's like we want those representatives from those different agencies to come to our school, and we want to build partnerships, and we know that we have better collaboration when we do that. Otherwise, we're just referring out, and referring out services is really different, I think, than working closely with representatives from those agencies. So we'll kind of talk about what that difference is. So a couple of years back, my colleagues and I really felt like we had to come up with like a Utah definition of what we feel like is collaboration in the context of transition for students with disabilities. And so this definition came about with collaboration at the state level between us as specialists and educators, along with our agency partners. So kind of those big partners we have throughout the state, such as Vocational Rehabilitation, Division of Services for People with Disabilities. And this is our definition we came up with. Interagency collaboration is a process in which education professionals establish partnerships with personnel from multiple agencies, and those are just a few that are in the parentheses, like VR, DSPD, and providers, and then also Career Tech Ed or CTE. And all of this we do to achieve a common goal to improve the post-secondary success of our students with disabilities. So again, it's more than just referring or kind of knowing that these agencies exist, but it's really having partnerships with actual representatives and personnel and people that work in those agencies, and really working to partner, right? To figure out how we can kind of fill in gaps that maybe education can't provide, and how do we make sure that we overlap these services and kind of blend and braid some of these things before students leave. So this is really the why behind it. Interagency collaboration is a means to coordinate services and supports at the student level. So really looking individually at students and, what do they need and what services are being offered by some of these other agencies that can really help support a student and their families. And then also to identify and address gaps in services. So I kind of mentioned that. So what I mean by that is, schools are obligated really to provide transition services, but sometimes we just don't have, the funds or the resources to provide everything a student needs. And that's why it's so important to reach out to these other types of services to see if it can fill some gaps for our students. And that we also want to share and leverage resources to reduce costs. So, oftentimes an agency might have funding that they can actually provide or give to an LEA to build a certain program. So we look at those opportunities, and I have actually lots of examples of that happening in the state. I won't go into detail about those right now, but we do have that happening in Utah. And then we really want to promote that efficient service delivery for all students, right? So we really want to make sure that we're accessing everything we possibly can. And then we really felt like it was important. This bottom statement on this slide is that we felt like these local interagency teams, and many schools and districts have these, but we really felt like we wanted to make sure that they should lead with this idea and philosophy and disposition and mindset that all students with disabilities can work. So what I have found in some of my work is that some LEAs might have a transition team and they're trying to get students out in job sites or really work on trying to get them employed before they leave, but they don't always include our students with the most complex needs, right? So they say all students, but then it's like, oh, but we're not really including those students in the life skills classroom down the hall. And we don't want to miss out on opportunities for all students. And we're talking even about our students with more complex needs. So we just added that to remind teams that when we say all, we are really meaning all students, and that we're not going to take work off the table for any student. All right, so this feels probably like a lot. I mean, as special educators, we're responsible for a lot of things, right? We provide instruction, and we're writing transition plans and progress, and relationships with families. I mean, the list goes on, right? So remember that this is not something that is a solo event, right? So you can't take this all on yourself, and you shouldn't. I know from my own experience when I was a transition teacher, I felt like I had to do it all. I mean, I was kind of, going out on the streets and going to employers and trying to make sure that my students had paid jobs before they left. And at the same time, write transition plans and manage all my paras. And I mean, the list goes on, and it can be super overwhelming, and it can burn you out. So this is where you want to leverage, right, those relationships and those connections to people in your building, in your district, and outside. So just remember, reach out. It's not, the expectation is not that you do this all yourself. So how do you do that? Well, become familiar with outside agencies, learn about them, invite them into your school. Start by searching on the web. I think I shared with you that website we just developed. There's lots of information on that. Go to transition fairs. We used to have a big state fair that included 5 different districts, but now most districts have taken on doing transition fairs themselves. So just about every school district has a transition fair. They happen throughout the year. Some choose to do it in the fall, some are doing it in the spring. But I would highly encourage, I mean, they're typically meant for students and families to go to, but I would say if you've never been to one, go, because you can learn a lot about, the different agencies and start to develop relationships with personnel that represent those agencies. So that's my next bullet, develop relationships with those representatives. It took me a while to really wrap my head around and understand like what a VR counselor does, and the different language that they use and the acronyms. And so I just would schedule time and just sit down with the VR counselor and say, like, explain to me what you do and tell me what your acronyms mean. And, we just kind of had those meetings instead of inviting them to the IEP and not really knowing them and not really understanding their agency and their services. And it was uncomfortable because I couldn't understand it and the parents couldn't understand it and the student definitely didn't understand it. So having kind of those upfront opportunities to meet and collaborate and really talk about roles and responsibilities is really worthwhile. And I think, like we talked a lot about this, developing relationships is kind of everything. Trust and relationships is where everything starts. So leverage connections in the community, including businesses. So, you know, um, if you know business owners or if you frequent certain businesses and you've gotten to know people that work in those business, kind of leverage those opportunities too. That could be a place where you take your students for a job shadow or an informational interview or possibly a job internship kind of a thing. So always kind of be thinking of the connections that you and even your colleagues have or your families have, and you can really leverage those too. So that's that next one. Ask colleagues and parents for leads to connect students. So when I was teaching in Murray School District, I didn't live there, right? But all my students did, and Murray's not very big, but I felt like I didn't really know the community that well. So I would ask colleagues and parents, like, do you know business owners? Do you have leads? Do you have places that you frequent that you have relationships with? And if you could connect me, I can take it to the next step, right? I can maybe create that as a job site for a student or a place for them to tour to see if they're interested in that type of work. So I would take lots of, ideas and referrals and so try to sort of network and then create opportunities for students based on those connections. So think about that. And then really mapping the community where the student lives. So especially if you're from a large district and your students are being bused, 30, 40 minutes from their home to your school. I mean, it's great to know what's around the school, but really what's important is that you know what's around the students' home, right? So I would go to my students' home and see, how far is the bus stop, right? Like, can they walk to the bus stop? How many streets do they have to cross? So really trying to get to know where the student lived, sort of mapping out the community, what's nearby, how can they access the community best, whether that be through walking or biking or using the bus. So you kind of have to get out there and map it out, figure out where your students live and what's around them and how they're going to navigate and be really involved in their own community. All right, so let's talk a little bit about kind of this legal requirement around collaboration in terms of what's on the transition plan. So back to that plan, we kind of went over this in the week that we talked about, all the components of the transition plan and how to be compliant in those. So this one, I have to be honest, I don't like the way that it is worded. It says, and this is directly off of the transition plan, it says, are the post-secondary transition services, experiences, or specialized instruction listed above likely to be provided or paid for by another agency? So, right, so it's asking you, like, are any of the transition services you put on the student's IEP or any kind of specialized instruction likely to be paid or provided by other agencies? I would say 80% of special ed teachers mark this box no. And I think part of the problem is the way that it's worded, right? So you're developing a transition plan for a student. Maybe you added some transition services that the student is going to explore work or, do some job shadows. But you're thinking, well, the school's going to do all that, right? So an outside agency is not paying or providing that. So it's kind of the obvious go-to to check no. But the problem with that is that we really want to include outside agencies. So what we would like to see is that the question or that the checkbox there be indicated that it is a yes, right? Because even though you or your school isn't directly paying for those services, we might reach out to VR. We might have pre-employment transition services create a job shadow or an internship for a student, for example, or they might be coming in and teaching job readiness workshops, right? So in that case, those service providers, they are paying and providing a service, right? So I know this is confusing, but I guess my takeaway here is that we really want to encourage this idea of collaboration, and it's okay to check yes. And I think it would be preferred to check yes on this section of the transition plan. However, that then triggers consent if you plan to invite that outside agency. So if you check yes, that means that we're really a representative of that service, whether that be a pre-ETS instructor or a VR counselor or a mental health provider or someone else, should be invited. But of course, we have to inform the parent, and we not only have to inform them, we have to get consent from them. So that triggers that consent document that a parent would have to sign, where you are essentially asking them if it's okay to invite that outside agency representative. Now, I want to bring your attention to that circle basis for decision. This is added to our transition plan to kind of as like a stopgap measure a little bit to say, are you sure you don't want to invite an outside agency? And if so, why not? Like, what is your basis for decision that you so quickly check the no box that the student doesn't need any kind of, um, you know, additional services from an outside agency? So you don't have to fill that basis for decision out, but it really is kind of this reminder of like, I shouldn't be so quick to say no, an outside agency isn't needed. Maybe I really should consider it. And what did I base that decision on, right? I mean, I would certainly say that any student with a disability would benefit from having an outside agency provide some services or at least explain their services. Potentially, maybe, you know, that year or the following year, they might actually get a service from that agency. So anyway, for whatever that is worth, I just want you to consider that. I know it takes a little bit of pre-planning because you got to get that consent from the parent prior, but it really is what we want to do, is what we want to see. It's an effective practice. All right, so community mapping. And this really is that kind of, 30,000-foot view, right? It's sort of like really looking at where do your students live? And even if you are teaching just elementary, I think this is always a great idea, right? Because we want students to access not just those disability services, but just anything else in their community that makes sense, whether it's for leisure or independent living, options for further education and training. Sometimes students don't know what's in their own community, or parents may not know that. Maybe they're new to the area. So this is a really great activity, I think, for teams and special educators to really engage in, is to see what's out there. There's a lot of whether they be like religious organizations, leisure, sports kinds of things, special interests. There's just so many things that can be in a community that we don't always know about. And the more we can map that out, I think the better we can do to kind of connect those. So we want to look for resources that are not just disability specific, but we want to look for those that are as well. So if there's an independent living center, those are centers that are designed for individuals with disabilities, and there are 5 throughout the state. Is there one of those? They often have summer camps, or they have activities, kind of fun leisure activities or other educational opportunities for students with disabilities. So check those out. And again, just like I mentioned, mapping that community around where they live, not just where the school is, right? Because that's super important, because when the students leave, we want them connected to their own communities, not where their school was, because they won't be coming anymore. So that's important. All right, so kind of planning your approach. The article you read was really pretty involved around this idea of Google mapping and making a kind of personalized map. And I love it. I have to say, for me, I haven't actually had experience doing that for a student. I have done it on a personal level, like I've gone to travel and I sort of like mark all the places that I like, and you can make comments on like restaurants that you like or places you visited, and I have shared maps that way. So like, for example, I went to Portugal and my daughter and I went to all these cool places and we mapped them all out, and then we shared that map with other people. So when they went to Portugal, they would have all these notes and all these marked areas of places that we really, really enjoyed. So it's sort of that same concept, but you're essentially making a personalized map for a student. So I think it's a really cool concept, but it's not the only way, right? I mean, you can do this in a spreadsheet format too. Certainly, you can call 211, which is that kind of information, local information about what's in the area. You can pull up a chamber of commerce in the area that the student lives and kind of see what businesses align with their interests. And so that might be a great way to kind of map out potential employment places for the student to explore. Social media, you can kind of see what is happening in certain neighborhoods that way as well. And then I think the best way is just like collaborating with others. So even in your own buildings or in your LEAs, social workers are often very connected to different services. You might have a community outreach specialist, and you might have somebody that specifically reaches out to a certain like the Spanish speaking community, for example. So though, if you have those people available to you, or parent groups, PTA or special needs like parent PTAs, those exist as well. So I would just say reach out, reach out, reach out, or even if you have in your school you have a break room or something and you're wanting to connect students to the community, you could just kind of put up on a bulletin board, I'm looking for businesses that, are centered around taking care of animals or something, right? And then you can have other colleagues maybe reach out to you with their connections. So it's kind of all about networking, right? Okay, so I think when we approach interagency collaboration, we want to kind of have some clear, goals, like why are we doing this, right? So we want it to be student focused. We also want to be super careful with using acronyms. I think it's super easy to alienate people when we use acronyms. I mean, that's kind of how I felt when I first started talking to VR counselors. Like they were using acronyms I was not aware of or not comfortable with. And I probably was doing the same because I was using acronyms in education. We have a ton, and every little, kind of pocket of area of where people work or the line of work they're in, they have their acronyms, and half the time we don't even notice that we're using them. So I would just say spell it all out or have a page of acronyms to ready to go, print it out to share with people. And then I think it's really important to establish a way that you're going to sustain ongoing communication. So what I mean by that is, okay, let's say you invite your VR counselor, you set aside some time, you chat, get to know each other. What do they provide? What are you doing to help and support students? How are you going to keep that communication going? Are you going to share your phone number so you can text each other? Are you going to email each other? Do you have some other way to communicate? Some schools use Slack and different platforms. So I think it's important to make sure that everyone kind of understands their communication style, right? Like some people love to just pick up the phone, other people love to do Zoom meetings. Some people only like to meet in person. So, have a conversation about that and kind of figure out how often and how you're going to continue to communicate with the folks that you're collaborating with. And then identify common goals, right? So for example, if you're sitting down with your VR counselor, it could be, all right, well, how many students do we have enrolled in VR? Or how many students are receiving pre-employment transition services? Or maybe the big goal is we've got to get our students out into authentic work experiences, right? So kind of having common goals and looking at data and sort of sharing data, and maybe you only have like one student that has explored any kind of work, and maybe by the end of the year you want that to be 5. So really kind of having conversations about those common goals. And I think that then helps, I think, strengthen the relationship, and that you both have skin in the game, right? Like it's helping their outcomes, and it's also helping your outcomes and your students. And then also it's super important to identify roles and responsibilities, like who's doing what, right? So, you might meet and share information, but I think it's really important to then outline next steps, like who's going to contact the parent and who's going to do this, and really be explicit about that. So there aren't any assumptions. Sometimes we have lots of assumptions like, oh, the VR counselor was supposed to do that, but were they really? Like, was that really documented? So just being mindful of that. And then, what are those outcomes? So where are you now, and where do you want to be, like in terms of improving students' services and outcomes? So being really transparent about that, I think. And I think anytime you document, you put things down on paper, they're more likely to get done than when you're just kind of chatting about it, and it's so easy to forget. I forget after a meeting, what we've said we're going to do. So now I have learned myself to always make sure that either I take notes or there is a note taker. and that we understand next steps and that we schedule and the next time to meet. So kind of hold yourselves accountable. Okay, so you might be asking, all right, well, who do I collaborate with? Well, I mean, the list kind of is endless, but of course, first and foremost, we've already heard me talk about this a lot. Um, just about every single student on an IEP would be eligible for vocational rehabilitation services. And even students that don't have an IEP can be eligible for vocational rehabilitation services. And that is because really any student with a disability that might have a barrier to employment, right? And I would say in many cases, our students with disabilities have some sorts of barriers to employment, either getting a job or keeping a job. And then all of our students ages 14 to 22 with a documented disability are eligible for this pre-employment transition services. And those are those pre-ETS services we talked about where instructor can come in and teach self-advocacy skills and workplace readiness skills and job career exploration. They can teach counseling on post-secondary. So they can teach students about, well, what is it like to prepare and, start to explore different educational and training opportunities after high school. So all of these services are really great. Just about every student in an IEP can qualify for these and they're free. So I think VR is sort of the obvious one, right? That's who you really want to be collaborating with first. Those counselors and also those pre-ETS instructors who work under those counselors. And then there are pre-ETS providers, and those are different providers. They are contracted, so all the money is coming from VR, but they are kind of these separate providers that are throughout our state. They're sprinkled throughout our state, and they do different things too. Some focus just on like internships for students and work-based learning and establishing. They'll go to a business and they'll try to work with that business to create an opportunity for a student to do some job exploration essentially. So I've linked all of this. So the slides are going to be in are in Canvas, and you can link these, and you can see the pre-ETS providers in your area. You can see who your counselor is that's assigned to your school. They're assigned to every high school in Utah. So definitely start there, but then certainly not limited to that. Those of you that are working with students with more complex needs, so students with intellectual disabilities, autism, developmental disabilities, they can, in most cases, qualify for the Division of Services for People with Disabilities, otherwise known as DSPD, and that's a service that is designed for students with more complex needs, and they can do things like community supports, living supports, and employment supports. Yes, there's a wait list. However, it's still really important to get students on that, and it's not a transition age thing. So, a 3-year-old student with a complex need can get on that list. So those of you that teach elementary, I'd really encourage your families to understand and know about DSPD and apply as soon as possible, because there is a wait list. So by the time their student leaves high school and they really need services, it's much more beneficial if they've been on that list since age 5, for example. So again, that links to the page as to how to apply. Other things, other people and staff you might want to collaborate with is I would highly recommend that you have some relationships with your career tech ed staff. We know that if students are involved in CTE, they have better outcomes. So we want our students exposed to all those rich, different career education, pathways, the certificates, the opportunities. It's all hands-on kinds of learning. So make sure students are invited to those kinds of CTE opportunities. And then we have Department of Workforce Services also available in Utah, and there's local offices all over the state, and they have representatives. So they used to be called youth counselors. They kind of changed the name, but again, that Workforce Services link will go to a page that talks about youth services, and they do things like resume building and internships and they workshops and things like that too. So there's services there. Then you might have some local mental health providers. Sometimes those are in the school. You may have relationships with mental health providers in your school or just even in the community, right? So if a student has a need around mental health, you'd want to make sure that you not only connect, but are just really aware of what's available through them. And then I mentioned independent living centers. There are 5 sprinkled throughout our state. And those offer lots of great opportunities with leisure, but also cooking classes and, going around the community. They have summer camps, and a lot of those services are really inexpensive or oftentimes free. And then you'll want to connect with employers, social workers, school counselors, and the list can go on. But so that is kind of the short list of who you might want to collaborate with. And that is it for this week. So certainly let me know if you have any questions about any of the resources or the readings. But I hope you have found this helpful in your practice, and I'll see you all next week.